Hello and welcome to this discussion on the race to decarbonize the built environment. I'm very sorry to have kept our audience waiting. We were just experiencing some technical problems, which we're hopefully now through. So we will get straight into it. We have two wonderful speakers today. Julie Sweet is Chief Executive even of Accenture. George Oliver is Chairman and Chief Executive of Johnson Controls. And they are here to tell us a little bit about the practical solutions to making buildings greener. We all know what the problem is. We've heard it 1,000 times. Now, how do we fix it? George, I'm going to come to you first on this. We know it's a huge issue. The built environment is a huge issue in terms of environmental performance and emissions. Generally, roughly 40% of global emissions accounted for by the built environment. How do governments, the private sector, individuals collaborate to make sure that buildings do get more sustainable?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thanks, George, for hosting the panel on such a very important topic, and one that's going to be core to being able to achieve our sustainability commitments, because buildings do represent about 40% of the global carbon footprint. And so because of that, we've been focused on how do we address the as-built buildings, because they do represent 70% of the buildings that will be operating in 2050. So it's going to be very important that we ultimately address this challenge. Historically, buildings have lagged other industries in regards to the deployment of digital technologies. And what I would say is the pandemic elevated the profile of buildings, not only focusing on the health and safety of buildings, but at the same time, the importance that they have supporting our customers now to achieve their net zero carbon emissions objectives, as they do represent about 40% of the global carbon footprint. And what we've been doing at Johnson Controls is not only continuing to develop technologies at the product and system level, but more important about how those technologies come together holistically and position Johnson Controls as a smart, healthy, and sustainable solutions leader across buildings. And this is with an integrated digital platform. And as a result, now we can fully integrate all of the building systems, and with the use of the data, now fundamentally focus on outcomes. So instead of looking at each individual system, how that all comes together and how the building operates, and ultimately achieving the outcomes. And this results in outcomes that can reduce the carbon footprint 50%. And then with that digital connectivity and the use of data, significantly improve the occupant experience, not just through health and safety, but also capabilities that enhance their productivity within the building. And so what we've been doing is not only focusing on the technology, but now deploying new business models for our customers that incorporate rapid solutions that are ultimately focusing on, that are critical to combating climate change and ultimately delivering on net zero building solutions. And we believe that we're positioned with the technology today to actually be able to achieve that. We're not waiting for new innovation or new technologies, that with new business models, we can ultimately make a significant impact. And so as a result, global policies, funding, incentivizing, and directly mandating decarbonized buildings are going to be important. For example, in the US, the Biden administration plans they're going to retrofit federal buildings and invest in much broader decarbonization. We're working across all of the stakeholders to help ensure that we have a constructive path, that it's understood, the opportunity, and then a constructive path with the actions that we're taking. And at the European level, Johnson Controls has been effectively supporting the EU's world-leading ambition to become carbon neutral by 2050. And we do support the EU climate law, which mandates the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions of 55% by 2030, and the renovation wave that will drive a tripling of the pace of building upgrades. And so on that, there's a lot of momentum. It's fundamentally changing how we view buildings, and buildings are an important element of being able to get to net zero carbon emissions. And I'm encouraged by the momentum that I see and the opportunity for all of the stakeholders to come together with a framework that ultimately will drive success.
That's excellent. Thank you, George. And Julie, I want to bring you in on this very quickly, though, George. Just one thing you mentioned, which I want to pick up on, is buildings have been a bit of a laggard here, particularly in terms of some of the technology applied. And I just wondered if there was a brief reason behind why that was.
My view on that, George, is that buildings, I think, historically have been viewed more from a cost standpoint, more as a balance sheet item, and weren't necessarily viewed as a strategic asset. And what we've seen with the pandemic, not only the focus on health and safety, but then more important in parallel with all the commitments that are being made to achieve the goals around climate change, have now realized that these are very important assets, not only in supporting our customers' growth and ultimately supporting their capabilities, but ultimately achieving our bigger goals around getting to net zero carbon and the like. And so what's happened is there's much higher level strategic engagement relative to the prioritization of the resources that are being deployed, and then the actions that ultimately can be taken to achieve the commitments that have been made.
Mm-hmm. And Julie, would you agree there that this is starting to be an appreciation of actually the value of buildings in this battle to reduce emissions, and where do you see opportunities for collaboration between governments and private enterprise here?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think it's important that sort of three things came together at once, right? So there's, I think, a universal understanding of the urgency to get to net zero, right? And you see that in COP26 and sort of that. So, the understanding of that coupled with the private sector commitment to contribute. And as soon as you get the private sector commitment to contribute, the CEOs are saying, well, how are we going to get there? Mm-hmm. And that's where the awareness has come around buildings, right? And it really took all three things. And then you add on top of that, though, and I think this is really important, is the new technology. Buildings were such that individual companies were not going to invest to build something to do what Johnson Controls has done. It's just by the very nature of it, the way they manage the buildings, the way the tech works. And you now have a path by leveraging the investment of Johnson Controls in a platform to actually do something about the buildings. And there's an important lesson in what George just talked about, because what he talked about was new business models, new way of looking at buildings, as a network. And so when you think about how does the government, how do these different sectors need to work together, the private sector, the government, the regulators, we also have to have new models of working together, right? So let me give you an example. This is new technology that's available. And so as you're thinking about regulating, right, you have to take into account that the technology, first of all, is available, but that it's not been built into the existing buildings. And as George said, they're going to be around in 2050, right? And so how you educate yourself as a regulator to understand the potential and what it's going to take to cost effectively be able to transform buildings using this technology, because the beauty of the technology is it works in existing buildings, right? And so that's where, we really need to think differently together, to operate differently together. And I'd say, one of the most important things that can come out of this discussion is that, addressing the building issue not only can be, but must be about existing buildings and not just new construction. And so how tenants work together to get green leases, how government regulators work with the real estate developers and the landlords to, find ways to have financial incentives that make it work, and that we all agree on how we're going to share data. Because, if I don't own the building and I need to share the data is absolutely critical to actually achieving our goals. And so really thinking about, as George said, new business models and also new engagement models that start with education and awareness, and then an understanding of, everybody's interests in order to get to a solution that is supported in all sides.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll pull out some of those themes in a bit more detail, in particularly around the use of data and measurement and technology, which you both touched on. But before we move into that, George, you mentioned, and Julie, you picked up on this, that it's the existing building stock that we're really talking about here. This is the nub of it. It's 70%, which will still be there in 2050. What's the best way? What's the starting place for decarbonizing a standing building? George, I'll come to you here first, but Julie, I'm sure you have plenty to offer on this too.
Sure. I think what's important most is understanding, from a customer perspective, where they are and what commitments have been made, and then ultimately, how do we align our capabilities to be able to work with them as a partner to solve the problem. And so we did a recent net zero pulse survey among a large group of building professionals shows the acceleration of net zero goal setting, that over 90% have significant goals to reduce carbon emissions and energy consumption by 2030, which is far ahead of the goals set out in the United Nations Paris Climate Agreement. And I think first and fundamental to all of those goals is driving energy efficiency. So to solve the climate challenge is not only reducing demand, but also then replacing the resulting demand with renewable energy supply and new technologies. So big focus is how do you take, because 75% of the 40% of the global carbon is operational, and we have a huge opportunity to be able to address that. And that is, smart, since efficiency cuts waste and frees up money, that ultimately you can take those benefits to be able to drive upgrades. And then to make it clear, you can replace, individual building systems, some of the old inefficient operating equipment, and deliver typically maybe 20 to 40% reduction. And that's ultimately serving the building like we always have with multiple independent systems. And so now what we've put together is we can magnify that digital solutions that connect all of those systems, really get an understanding of the connectivity with the lights and the security and the HVAC and building controls. And then how is that building operating with all of the occupants, and making sure that you're optimizing all of that together and focusing on an outcome. And with that, we can get to 70 or 80% cuts. And so as Julie also has reinforced, digital solutions are absolute key in helping building owners and reduce their carbon footprint and save energy for their buildings. And just one example, through our solutions, such as we have an open blue digital platform and multiple capabilities now that we've developed. And one is a net zero advisor that we ultimately can deliver real-time AI-driven tracking and reporting of sustainability metrics, which this helps facility managers ensure and improve that the net zero carbon reduction and the renewable energy impact of their buildings, how that ultimately plays out. And based on criteria such as LEED certification, the new technology automatically gathers and analyzes the data about, it can be energy and water and materials and ultimately the greenhouse gas emissions that are involved in every phase of a building's life cycle, and proves that we are achieving the CO2 emissions reductions, renewable energy, and ultimately efficiency gains. And this will generate energy and environmental outcomes from improving just the basic building operations. And then maybe we'll talk a little bit further where beyond the building, as we look at the ecosystem around buildings, then how do we work more broadly with other partners that enable us to be able to, with the resulting demand, how do we bring in the right renewable solution that ultimately then replaces the fossil fuel energy that's being consumed? And so this is a big deal. We believe that a complementary set of energy policies that I think are needed to overcome some of the market barriers to energy efficiency, accelerate the emission reductions, and ultimately reduce the overall cost of the compliance to businesses and consumers. And these policies include what we've been working actively is not only around building codes, building performance labeling, and then ultimately financial incentives for the energy efficiency retrofit. So, I mean, it's a big opportunity, and there's a lot that I covered there, but I believe that bringing all of the key stakeholders within that framework achieve some significant benefits, with the reduction of carbon.
Mm-hmm. Julie, I want to bring you in on that same question of how best to reduce, but I mean, if you could bring in any of your own experience at Accenture and what you're doing across your estate of offices, then that'd be fascinating now.
Yeah, well, let's just start with, I think what we're talking about is how you address demand at scale, right? So there's a lot of focus on supply and the transition to renewables, right? Buildings represent the ability in the near term to address demand at scale. And what that requires is that you begin to see your buildings, if you have multiple locations, as a network that can be managed using digital technology to reduce energy efficiency in a much easier way, digitized and with access to talent that you don't have to grow yourself. And I think what's most exciting about what we're talking about today is this idea of being able to address demand at scale based on what's available today. And that's really where George and I started, now about a year ago, when we both have a passion. It's not only our business, but it's our passion on how do we make a difference now? Because the transition to greener energy is going to take years. It's complicated. There's technology innovations that don't exist yet, right? But what we really saw was with the work that Johnson Controls was doing around the digitization, that if you bring that together, this is not at the end of the day rocket science. If you have the technology and you understand the industry, you can create solutions that are replicable, right? That get tweaked a little bit, but by industry. And that's really where we kind of came together and said, we need to make this more like a product, something that we can accelerate to help our clients make their commitments and go after what in the end is actually low-hanging fruit, right? Now that the technology is there. And I emphasize that because one of the reasons this is more of a newer conversation, we were talking about how you're hearing a lot about it, is 2 years ago, right, even 12 months ago, this kind of technology, the ability to have these new business models really wasn't available. And now with OpenBlue it is, and also with their managed services where you can access the talent. And that's what's different about right now. And so, if you're listening to this and you're saying, okay, how do I add value at my company in terms of being able to reduce emissions in the near term, right? This is what we are focused on helping, right? And it's real and very tangible.
And just on that, I mean, you used the phrase low-hanging fruit, and I think it's a very, very good point that you make. But I wonder, could you just talk us through, if you're moving down the curve towards net zero, some of the low-hanging fruit, and then how hard does it get as you approach that zero figure?
Sure, George, you want to start and then I'll add?
Yeah, or George, you kick off with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're demonstrating today, I mean, part of it is putting what we have today in action, working with customers. And so I think every day, I can use some examples where, we work with customers in deploying not only our heat pump technology and applying that in district heating, which that in itself drives significant efficiency, but now with the digital connectivity and how that is actually deployed across a community, we can deliver 300 to 400% efficiency. And so these examples are real, and that's on existing buildings, and then even in new buildings, working with the Dubai Energy and Water Authority, we've worked with them. It's the tallest, I believe it's the tallest, smartest government building in the world. And by working with them very proactively in how the building was built and how it was connected and the use of data, we've been able to, and then as part of that was the remaining demand, actually have a renewable supply of the remaining demand. We've been able to get to actually where we're generating energy and we reduce the water consumption by 50%. That is being done today. And so both in the built environment as well as in the new construction, a whole different level of thinking of how buildings, are going to be ultimately operated, and then the new buildings are going to be built. And so those are a couple near-term examples, but I could go on and give you dozens of those. And the point is now, how do we get what we've built that can be scaled, ultimately deployed more broadly across, the sectors of the economy?
And just quickly on that, I want to bring in a question from the audience, and should say here, anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, will come to them throughout the discussion. So do drop them in. But someone has asked, and I could probably hazard a guess at what your answer to this might be, but does the reality of embodied carbon make refurbishment preferable to rebuilding or building new?
Yeah, so I would say that, there's obviously there's trade-offs. I believe that we can, for the most part, deliver similar type benefits with digital technologies and taking existing buildings and ultimately delivering similar type outcomes. Now, the example that I shared with Dubai Energy and Water Authority is unique because we started from scratch. And so you'd have to look at, when you look at the paybacks of new versus upgrade, typically based on where we are today, the upgrade is very efficient and ultimately delivering a good payback. So I don't believe that we're in a situation where it's going to force a lot of ultimate new buildings. As I said, I think the current projection is that 70% of the buildings today are going to be operating in 2050. And so when you look at the embedded carbon within those buildings, these have to be solved. And I think that's where we believe, not only through our technology, but our go-to-market and now with new business models, that we're positioned now to be able to solve those and create. I think the other big takeaway is different than other industries where, as they drive towards net zero carbon, there's a cost, and there's maybe additional cost that ultimately has to be covered by the industry. Within this segment, in many cases, we can do a net zero building solution. We can finance it, and then over a period of time can ultimately get a payback. So not only are you getting the payback through the operational savings, but you then achieve your net zero carbon targets that you made. So there's not many, I don't believe today, not many examples where with the technology that exists today, the demonstration of how that can be deployed effectively and ultimately achieving the outcomes. It's a great opportunity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Julia, I think earlier you used the word holistic when we were describing, who holds responsibility for this, having to take a holistic approach to buildings, and everyone taking responsibility to some degree. But I wanted to touch in particular on as an occupier of a building, what should you be lobbying for in order to start that transition towards a net zero building when you don't actually own the property? Do you have a view on that, Julie?
Yeah, George, it's really important because it's one of the things that from the very beginning we collaborated on to say, those who own their buildings, and there are lots of people who own their buildings, lots of companies have the ability to unilaterally make the decision to treat the buildings like a network, to implement the technology, to be able to implement the new business models. And so that's, it's a strategic choice that they can make. If you are leasing then it's a different set of questions for you. I think it starts with, at the end of the day, the conversation with the landlord, right? Because, for example, if you never have the conversation with the landlord, then nothing's going to change, right? And for the major developers in particular, and we're not trying to start with the small buildings, but for those, in every country of major developers, driven by companies with significant office space, there's a lot of leverage. There's also regulation, right, coming, and we think there's an opportunity both as within buildings as a tenant, but also bringing together where we started the private sector and the government to create the incentives to do so. So like the education as to what would it make it, because at the end of the day, it needs to be a win-win, right? There's no circumstance where you as a company can sort of say, hey, I'm leasing, so it's someone else's problem, right? So first of all, they need the data. So you've got to cooperate to give the data that allows the technology to work, but also there is a cost to these systems, right? And so, and I think there's a variety of things, and we're seeing that. So you've got some communities where the local chamber is working on this, right? You've got other communities where you've got, tenant associations kind of working on this. So it starts with that recognition that we're going to have to work together differently, but also that first conversation and an acknowledgement that it's a shared responsibility. The moment this becomes, hey, you need to deliver this, as opposed to an understanding it's a shared responsibility, we won't get there. And I think that's why the value of these conversations is to sort of think differently about it. But very importantly, not simply say, because I'm leasing, there's nothing I can do. And you see that with the momentum that's building around this, is that we all need to do something. And the models we have to use are going to be different depending on both the industries, but also the way that you occupy buildings. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I want to change tack here slightly, and George, I'll come to you first on this one. I mean, we've already seen, particularly in the last year, the impact of more extreme weather conditions on the built environment. How should urban planning and building resilience and construction be adjusting to those new normals?
Yeah, let me go back to what Julie mentioned there about the lessor and lessee, because I think that is an important element given how real estate is managed today, and ultimately how the economics at work. And I think one way that we can break through and align those interests is through what we call a new tool called building performance standards. And in those standards, regulators put forward a number of increased efficiency and or reduced carbon per square foot. And we believe this would be a huge catalyst to getting alignment and would immediately accelerate the required actions to deliver significant carbon reduction in buildings. And so we've been working very hard on creating the building performance standards and is a trusted resource to the government, to NGOs, as well as business players. And we expect that actually by the end of the current year, 10% of all commercial real estate in the US will be operating under a building performance standards progress, which I believe is now accelerating. So the good news is, we're starting low, but we're starting to see acceleration. So in answer to your question, I would say 80% of the world's population is expected to live in cities by 2050. So I think preparing to make the required infrastructure investments to ensure longevity is very important. And for decades, urban environments have encroached on the natural environment, and ultimately we believe that we can significantly change that. We built them bigger, and that has required more energy, more resources, and ultimately more expansion into the natural environments. And we believe that moving forward, we think that humanity can leverage technology such as 5G, IoT, and artificial intelligence to transform cities to healthier and safer, much more sustainable spaces that at first take less from the surrounding environments and eventually give back. And I think the example I said previously with district heating is a great example for that environment. And then especially post-COVID, people want places to be able to live, work, and play in healthy, dynamic places. And now that we're recovering, leaders and owners are rethinking how to create spaces and places that are adaptive and focused on new use. And a lot of our activity today with our customers is just that. How do I repurpose my space? How do I ultimately address the new way of work and ultimately what's going to be required? And that's been a big focus of ours. So carbon efficient, secure, connected, resilient communities is what ultimately we consider a smart city. So smart city for decades has been a buzzword. We actually can take smart city and put it to work with real fundamentals that deliver real outcomes, not only in the carbon footprint, but also the experience within the cities. Mm-hmm. And while the investment, I go back to technology, is vital to the rise in cities advancing, and we're working across a number of cities, the end goal must be that the investment must drive economic prosperity and ultimately protect the planet. And I think more important than ever, given the problem that we're working to solve, citizens care about the healthy planet and want to see the climate change addressed, and that's what we're positioned to do.
Mm-hmm. Julie, would you agree with that characterization of a resilient smart city of the future?
I do. In fact, we've been talking about smart city at Accenture for a decade, and it used to be sort of like a little bit of a groan, like, okay, well, that's a business going nowhere. Okay, so and a decade ago that was true, right? There was neither the commitment nor the technology, nor frankly the pull from citizens or customers, right? And all of the data and the research right now says it does matter, and I think it's important that we all think of this as both, if you're a company, being able to say that as a part of what you're doing, you're taking these tangible actions really matters to your people. And then as a city, as you're trying to attract people to be in your urban environment, having taken those steps also really matters. And all of the research across the board says that it matters today and that it's an increasing value in terms of where you live and what you buy. And I'll just tell you at Accenture, when we announced our earnings this year, our fiscal year ended August 31st, one of the things that I now do, even in my earnings call, is I start with what I call the 360-degree value that we created. So there was sort of hey, we had a great year and we created a lot of value, and including our what we were doing around sustainability and particularly climate change. And then I get to the financials. And why am I doing that, right? It's because the investors care, our people who are listening care, and our clients care. Right. And so our entire business strategy is now on creating 360-degree value, embedding sustainability. When we do a lot now with digitizing manufacturing and the supply chain. And part of the early conversations that we had with George was that we wanted to embed the thinking around buildings, helping our clients see that when they're digitizing manufacturing, they should be thinking about the building itself at the same time. And that because these things talk to each other, right? And the way OpenBlue has been created to have, open APIs, and but you have to look at it holistically as well. And it's super important. I think there's a huge opportunity. We talk about building back better. There's 70% increase in the investment in digital transformation in companies. And it's happening all across enterprises. And being able to link these things so that you leverage the investment. So think about manufacturing and buildings, right? Thinking about the investments you're making in health and safety and new contactless check-ins and how that relates to, once you have much digital solutions around people coming in, that creates the data that can feed into a better use from an energy perspective using the functionality of an OpenBlue, right? Those things are connected, and there's too much siloed thinking. And, if anything comes out of, this is making sure that you're asking the question across your digital transformation and across the ways you're working, where does the building fit in?
There's an excellent audience question here, Julie, which I'm going to put to you. And speaking of things that Accenture have been working on for a decade, I imagine this phrase is familiar for even longer than that. But the circular economy, so someone in the audience has asked, to what extent did the companies incorporate circular economy principles into their net zero building ambitions? And you mentioned their holistic approaches again. And yeah, I wonder if you could take that question on.
And so what was the actual question, George?
It's to what extent should companies be incorporating circular economy principles more broadly than just energy efficiency into these net zero strategies?
Yeah, I mean, we think about it more broadly, actually, in the whole space of the circular, of the supply chain and in operations, right? So whether it's the way you're reusing equipment, whether it's how you're looking at in your supply chain, how you're doing, different ways of commuting to work, the ways of doing, logistics. We're seeing, for example, in the oil and gas industry, something we started in 2015 in Asia, where we've got in cooperation with the World Economic Forum, where we're actually sharing platforms. So if you think about drilling offshore, you've got 3 different companies who are all ferrying people to the similar areas, right? And so when you think about the circular economy, it's not just energy efficiency, but it's, the sharing that you get from across companies, right? So I think the circular economy principles are both important within, but also when you think about it industry-wide.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic, thank you. And George, I want to come to you now. You've just returned from Glasgow and COP26, which has obviously been the backdrop to this conversation and many others over the last couple of weeks. Do you think the pledges that have come out of that, the conversations that have taken place, will be translated now into meaningful action?
Yeah, I was able to spend 4 days at COP26, and what I would tell you, my takeaway is it has been extremely successful in bringing governments and businesses together to continue to press for climate progress. It also, I think, through the process is the recognition of how important the built environment is in being able to tackle climate change. So buildings have gotten a lot of attention. We've talked a lot about the footprint, the 40% carbon footprint. And I believe that with that recognition, we're pleased, I was very pleased to see a lot of attention put on that, as well as a major policy push in many countries to ultimately incentivize building upgrades. And what I would say, George, is that leaving COP, I am encouraged. I think, and I'll talk a little bit about the work we've done with the Business Roundtable, with the way that businesses have come together, and not only within the US, but more broadly across the globe, and across all sectors of the economy, to ultimately address the challenges of climate change. And we believe that ultimately the business community is going to be accountable to actually be able to take the appropriate actions to deliver on the goals that we set out to achieve. And so that's number one. And then what I'm very encouraged that it was absolutely recognized that the business community had a much bigger presence because of that. And so therefore, encouraged by the way the policymakers have engaged the business community now to begin to understand, what is necessary from a policy standpoint that ultimately is going to support the critical actions, ultimately to be able to deliver on the required changes. So I participated over the last, it's really been the last 6 or 9 months, working with not only in the Business Roundtable, we have over 200 US company CEOs, and I'm focused on with the Energy and Environment Committee that I chair, focusing on all of the issues related to climate change. And we've expanded our influence working with the European Roundtable, the Business Council of Mexico, the Business Council of Canada, the Business Council of Australia. And prior to COP, we thought it was important to put together a joint statement of our commitment as a business community. And we did that. And part of that was a call to action for policymakers we laid out 7 actions that we believe were going to be critical to success. And I think as a result of that, the engagement at COP was very different relative to how we now get the public, the private sector together, understanding the problem in more depth, and then understanding what it's going to take to ultimately solve it. So, I'm encouraged at the level of engagement with policymakers, and then the full alignment, I think, between the public and private sector, which is critical. And more important, I think, the urgency. So no matter who you engage with, the urgency and then the commitment to solving the problem, I think is clear. And I think in Johnson Controls, we're not only holding ourselves accountable to ambitious goals around what we achieve with our footprint, but also demonstrating that we can have a significant impact with the transition of what we're doing with our customers within their built business environment. So I think overall, it'll be interesting to see now, is this a catalyst to now, as Julie said earlier in the discussion, of okay, we've got the commitment, now it's about the how, and all of the key stakeholders working together to put the right fundamentals in place, in each of the industries that ultimately achieve what we're setting out to do.
Well, let's talk briefly about that. How, Julie, I want to come to you and just ask what role you think technology and digital solutions are going to play in this push towards net zero, and also maybe to touch briefly upon the importance of measurement and monitoring here, and how tech can help with that side of things too.
Yeah, well, let me start on the measuring and monitoring, because commitment's important. The how is in fact the technology enablement. So we actually could not achieve these without that, and so there's great technology available now with the commitment. And then I think we've talked a lot about that, including the solutions George has talked about that Johnson Controls has done, but that's absolutely critical for the how. But you also need the transparency and accountability. And I think what's seismic really about what happened at COP26 that maybe people are not as much focused on is the announcement that the different standard setting boards are going to come together around one standard. And why does that matter? Well, first of all, we're a company that in December will actually report against 3 different standards, because we do believe transparency is so important, and it's super costly, and it doesn't allow you to really compare companies across industries or within an industry. And so the decision that these competing standards will come together will enable transparency that's meaningful, because you can actually start to compare, you can start to understand by industry and cross industry. And I think many companies are willing to be transparent, but trying to do so with so many standards is very difficult. And once you have the transparency, you have the accountability. And I will just tell you that as a CEO, you never put your numbers out if you don't think they're going to improve, right? And so, once you sort of committed, which I think everyone will be forced to do once the excuse around competing standards goes away, if nothing, or by the regulators, it'll, probably differ by country. Once you're out there, the numbers have to get better, right? And so it's this, combination. And I think without that decision, it would actually make it more difficult to have the commitment and the how turn into outcomes, because transparency is really important, and a way to hold people accountable and for companies themselves to be able to hold themselves accountable is super important.
George, would you agree that that's a seismic development, the standardization of ESG reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, because you know, you get what you measure, and then what you measure needs to be consistent across the board so that everyone's working towards the same goals and ultimately being measured in a similar fashion. So I think this is a big step forward, and I think it's going to be helpful to make sure that with the commitments are being made, that there's real accountability and this consistency of how we're actually tracking our progress.
Mm-hmm. We are just over time for our originally advertised scheduling, so I'm going to bring us to a close in a moment, but I wanted to ask you both just if there was one piece of advice that you would like those of us, those who've tuned in to leave with. I know we tried to keep this very practical and action orientated, so if there's one thing you would suggest as they start this journey towards net zero that they leave with, what would it be? Julie, could we come to you first on that one?
Sure. The first thing is to ask the question, right? How are the way you're operating your buildings helping you reduce your carbon emissions, right? And so if you don't understand how all this is working, you know, that you're using digital technology, that you put, you know, all of these things in, then it's probably not happening, right? So I think starting by asking that question, you know, are the way we're operating buildings part of our solution to getting to net zero is super important.
Fantastic, thank you. And George?
Yeah, and what I would say, what we've learned is make sustainability fundamental to all that you do. In Johnson Controls, we've had a legacy here where it has been central, and we've made a lot of progress over the last 2 decades, and we've made ambitious targets here on a go-forward basis, because we now are taking all of our learnings and putting that to work in a much bigger way. And I think if you put it center to everything you do, then your decision-making is aligned to ultimately not only being able to deliver on your business strategy, but making some, you know, sustainability core to that. I think, and you can do both. And I think with the goals that have been set, you know, there's been very aggressive goals set by 2050 and by 2030. And I think as it relates to buildings, understanding what the significance, you know, the significance footprint that your buildings have, and then understanding that we have simplified that as Johnson Controls and working with Accenture, that an 8-step journey that can easily assess and put our customers on a roadmap to decarbonize their buildings. And that's supported by not only our product technologies, but our digital technologies. And what I would say is, because it's been fundamental to what we do, we have 100,000 colleagues across the globe that are deployed every day working with customers, that this is in their blood and committed to not only our ambitious goals, but also how we enable our customers to be able to deliver on their commitments. And what I would say is that the importance here is that the new world is going to be an ecosystem of partners that is going to be fueled by commitment and technology. And we believe in Accenture and Johnson Controls, a great example. We bring combined strengths working together that has elevated our ability to be able to solve the bigger problem. And we're very encouraged by the participation across the ecosystem that we play in, and the ability to be able to leverage our history and legacy, but even more so now on a go-forward basis, technology and our people's passion for what we do, combined with what Accenture does to really ultimately elevate our capabilities and deliver significant results.
Wonderful. It's a good, positive place to leave it. George, Oliver, thank you so much. Julie, Sweet, thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you for dialing in. It's been a pleasure.
Great.
Thank
Thanks.
you, George.